Introduction. Get comfortable. Let your body settle. And let the world outside this moment fall away for a while. Every day, without your knowledge, forces you cannot name are shaping the choices you make, the belief you hold, and the person you believe yourself to be. Not through force, not through obvious manipulation, but through something far more precise. The deliberate exploitation of the architecture of the human mind. Psychology is the study of how people think, feel, and behave. But in the wrong hands, it becomes something else entirely. A toolkit, a manual, for influence, for control, for the quiet reshaping of another person's reality, without their ever noticing it is happening. Tonight, we are going to walk through the darkest corners of that toolkit. These are the tricks used by advertisers to empty your wallet, by abusers to hollow out your confidence, by leaders to manufacture loyalty, in millions of people who believe they arrived at their devotion freely. These are the patterns that repeat across history, across cultures, across every kind of human relationship, where one person wants something from another and is willing to take it through, means they would never openly admit. You do not need to do anything with this information tonight. You do not need to take notes or keep score or catalog the people in your life against what you are about to hear. Just listen. Let these ideas settle into the part of you that will recognize them when it matters, because awareness is the only reliable defense against any of what follows. These are the darkest psychology tricks ever documented, and the first step to freedom from them is simply knowing their names. 1. Gaslighting. Imagine waking up one morning and finding that the world around you has quietly rearranged itself. Not in ways you can point to clearly, but in ways that make you feel perpetually disoriented. You remember a conversation. The other person says, "It never happened." You notice something is wrong. You are told you are imagining things. You feel certain of something. You are asked, gently but persistently, whether you might be losing your mind. This is gaslighting, named after a 1944 film, in which a husband secretly dims the gas-powered lights of his home and then insists to his wife that the lights have not changed, that the problem is in her perception, not in reality. What makes gaslighting so devastating is not any single lie or any single denial. It is the accumulation. Each individual instance feels small enough to doubt. Maybe you did miss. Maybe you are being oversensitive. Maybe your memory is not as reliable as you thought. The manipulator carefully cultivates this doubt over weeks and months, until the victim has lost their fundamental trust in their own perception. Once that trust is gone, the manipulator becomes the arbiter of reality. Whatever they say happened is what happened. Whatever they say you said, you said. Whatever they claim about the past becomes the past. The victim, stripped of their confidence in their own mind, becomes entirely dependent on the person who is destroying them. Research on gaslighting consistently shows that it tends to work most effectively when the victim has a strong emotional attachment to the gaslighter. A stranger can tell you that you are misremembering, and you simply won't believe them. But a partner, a parent, a close friend, whose opinion you have trusted for years, when they question your reality with sincerity and repetition, the doubt takes hold in ways you cannot easily dislodge. The antidote to gaslighting is something that sounds simple, but is genuinely difficult to practice. Documentation. Write things down. Keep records. Date your entries. When something happens, write what you saw and heard and felt, before the other person has a chance to tell you what you saw and heard and felt. Gaslighting is a technique built on the malleability of memory. It cannot survive evidence. If there is someone in your life who consistently makes you feel confused, forgetful, irrational, or as though your grip on reality is slipping, trust that feeling. The problem may not be your memory. It may be who is holding the pen. 2. Love bombing. You have never felt so seen, so wanted, so completely and thoroughly understood by another person. Within days of meeting them, they are texting you constantly, telling you that you are unlike anyone they have ever encountered, making plans for the futures with an enthusiasm that takes your breath away. It feels like the universe has finally delivered something you did not dare to ask for. There is a word for what you are experiencing. Not romance, not destiny. Love bombing. Love bombing is the deliberate, strategic flooding of another person with affection, attention, and adoration in the early stages of a relationship. Not because those feelings are genuine, but because they are investment. The love bomber is not falling for you. They are building you into a position of dependency so complete that by the time the real dynamic of the relationship emerges, you will be too attached, too invested, too hopeful of returning to those early days to see clearly or leave easily. The neurological mechanism is straightforward. When someone showers you with attention and validation, your brain releases dopamine in significant quantities. The same dopamine system that underlies addiction, that makes the first hit of any pleasurable substance so powerful and so memorable, is now associating this person with pleasure and reward. You begin to need them in a way that feels indistinguishable from genuine love because, neurologically, the experience is similar. Then comes the withdrawal. The texts slow. The warmth recedes. The person who made you feel extraordinary suddenly treats you with indifference or coldness. And your brain, which has been flooded with dopamine every time this person paid attention to you, now experiences that withdrawal exactly as a withdrawal from a substance, with craving, with anxiety, with an overwhelming impulse to do whatever it takes to get back to how things were. This is not a coincidence. It is the mechanism. The love bomb establishes the addiction. The withdrawal activates the craving. The intermittent reappearance of warmth and closeness keeps you endlessly chasing the high of those first days. The love bomber does not need to keep performing. They simply need to be unpredictably enough that you never give up. Real love does not need to overwhelm you in the first 2 weeks. It does not need to make you feel as though you have finally, suddenly found the person who understands you completely after 3 conversations. If something feels too perfect, too fast, if the intensity feels more like flooding than like warmth, pay attention to that feeling. It is information. 3. The dark. Triad researchers studying destructive interpersonal behavior eventually arrived at a cluster of 3 personality traits that, when present together, created some of the most consistently damaging patterns in human relationships. They named this cluster the Dark Triad, and understanding it may help you recognize a pattern you have been struggling to name. The first trait is narcissism, not the casual narcissism of someone who enjoys attention, but clinical narcissism, a deep, structural conviction of one's own superiority, combined with a chronic need for admiration and a fundamental inability to genuinely experience other people as fully real. To the narcissist, you are a mirror or a prop. You have value insofar as you reflect their greatness back to them. The moment you fail to do so, you are discarded or punished. The second trait is Machiavellianism, named after the Renaissance writer whose political philosophy argued that a skilled leader must be willing to deceive, manipulate, and use calculated cruelty to maintain power. Machiavellianism describes a worldview in which relationships are purely transactional. Every person is a resource. Every interaction is an opportunity. Every display of warmth or concern is a tool deployed in service of an outcome. The third trait is psychopathy, characterized by low empathy, reduced fear response, impulsivity, and a particularly chilling ability to mimic the emotional responses that other people have naturally. The psychopath is not always the violent criminal of popular imagination. More frequently, they are charming, articulate, confident, and disturbingly good at telling you exactly what you need to hear, because they have learned your needs through observation rather than sharing them. Together, these three traits remove most of the psychological constraints that prevent ordinary people from exploiting others. The fear of hurting someone, the guilt of betrayal, the discomfort of witnessing another person's pain. These guardrails are either absent or deliberately bypassed in high-scoring dark triad individuals. Research has found these traits somewhat overrepresented in positions of leadership, entertainment, and finance, fields that reward charisma, risk, tolerance, and the ability to make decisions without excessive emotional interference. This is not to say all leaders or executives possess these traits, but the traits confer specific advantages in competitive, high-stakes environments that select for certain kinds of performance over certain kinds of character. You cannot change a person who scores high on these traits, but you can recognize the pattern when it appears. The charm that feels slightly performed, the empathy that shows up only when convenient, the persistent sense that you are being managed rather than known. 4. Fear-mongering. The most powerful switch in the human brain is not the one for pleasure. It is the one for fear, and those who understand how to flip it have held disproportionate power over human populations for, povas caesa, as long as power has existed. When you are genuinely afraid, your prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational analysis, careful evaluation, and considered judgment, is partially suppressed by the limbic system. Your amygdala takes over. Your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline. You stop evaluating. You stop questioning. You react. You seek safety. And most critically, you look to whoever is presenting themselves as the source of protection. Fear-mongering is the deliberate creation and amplification of fear, targeted at a specific audience, in order to produce a specific response. It is not simply scary news. It is scary news structured to make you run toward a predetermined destination. The threat and the solution are always sold together, because without the solution, the fear has nowhere to go. In advertising, fear-mongering operates through implication. Without this product, you are inadequate. Without this service, you are vulnerable. Without this upgrade, you are falling behind. Each message deposits a small dose of anxiety and then immediately offers relief, contingent on a purchase. The transaction is not a commercial exchange. It is a ransom. In political discourse, fear-mongering operates at a much larger scale and with considerably higher stakes. The playbook is ancient and remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. A threat, describe it in visceral and urgent terms. Make it feel immediate. Make it feel personal. Fulfill. Position yourself as uniquely capable of addressing it and make any questioning of the threat feel like collaboration with it. Any critic of the narrative becomes, by this logic, an agent of the danger. What makes fear-mongering particularly effective is not simply that it activates the threat response. It is that once activated, the threat response is self-perpetuating. A mind primed for danger sees danger everywhere. Each new ambiguous piece of information gets interpreted through the lens of the original fear. The original message is confirmed again and again by a world that the frightened mind has been trained to misread. The antidote is almost impossibly simple and almost impossibly difficult. Slow down. Fear-based messages are always urgent because urgency prevents reflection. If you are being asked to act immediately on the basis of fear, the most subversive thing you can do is wait. Ask who benefits from your fear. Ask what they are selling. The answer is almost always visible. Once you are no longer afraid enough to look away. 5. Guilt tripping. There is a form of manipulation so smoothly integrated into ordinary speech that most people who deploy it never consciously recognize they are doing so. And most people who receive it never consciously recognize they are being controlled. It moves through relationships disguised as honesty, as concern, as love. It is called guilt tripping. Genuine guilt is a healthy signal. It is the internal alarm that fires when your actions have conflicted with your values. A prompt to repair, to apologize, to grow. But manufactured guilt is something else entirely. It is guilt that has been deliberately induced to produce compliance. Created not by your actions, but by someone else's rhetorical choices. The architecture of a guilt trip is consistent, regardless of who is deploying it. The manipulator takes your normal, legitimate behavior, your boundary, your preference, your need, and reframes it as an act of harm or neglect. After everything I've done for you, I guess I just don't matter to you anymore. You always do this. You never think about how your choices affect other people. None of these statements describe what you actually did. They describe who you supposedly are, and they deposit a feeling of being defective, a feeling that can only be relieved by giving the manipulator what they want. Children are particularly susceptible to guilt tripping because they lack the cognitive vocabulary to identify the manipulation. A child who is repeatedly told that their ordinary expressions of individuality are hurtful to their parents learns to associate self-expression with causing harm. This association does not dissolve automatically in adulthood. It gets carried into every subsequent relationship, creating a person who apologizes reflexively, who shrinks in the presence of anyone who implies they are not doing enough, who feels guilty for wanting things. The professional context is equally fertile ground. A manager who says, "I thought you were a team player," in response to a reasonable refusal, is not commenting on your teamwork. They are deploying manufactured guilt to override your legitimate judgment. The guilt is not earned, but it feels earned. And for most people, the feeling is sufficient to produce compliance. Distinguishing genuine guilt from manufactured guilt requires one question asked with genuine honesty. Or am I only feeling wrong because someone wants me to feel that way? The answer to that question, followed honestly, is the beginning of a boundary. 6. The halo effect. In the early 20th century, a psychologist named Edward Thorndike noticed something strange in the data he was collecting from military officers rating their subordinates. The ratings were supposed to be independent, each quality assessed on its own merits, but they were not independent at all. Officers who were rated highly on one quality were rated highly on almost all qualities. The data showed a kind of invisible force field of positive judgment that spread from one impressive trait to every other trait in its vicinity. Thorndike called this the halo effect, and in the century since his discovery, it has turned out to be one of the most pervasive and most ruthlessly exploited cognitive biases in human psychology. The halo effect works because human cognition is lazy in a very specific way. Evaluating each quality of a person or thing independently requires sustained attention and distant compartmentalization. Cognitive resources that the brain uses sparingly. It is far more efficient to use one strong, clear signal as a proxy for all the others. This person is attractive. Therefore, they are probably also intelligent, probably also kind, probably also trustworthy, probably also competent. The brain fills in all the blanks from a single data point. The exploitation of this bias in commercial life is so thorough that it has become the foundation of an entire industry. Luxury brands do not primarily sell products. They sell halos, the aspiration, the beauty, the exclusivity of the imagery surrounding a product radiates outward and coats the product itself with presumed quality. The car is not advertised with specifications. It is advertised with a mountain road at dawn and a figure whose life is so precisely and beautifully configured that you experience the car as a path toward that life. In human relationships, the halo effect creates some of its most dangerous distortions. A person who is physically beautiful, socially confident, and articulate is experienced by most observers as probably also kind, probably also ethical, probably also reliable. This perception can survive substantial contradictory evidence because the halo is constantly regenerating. The same confidence that made them attractive in the first place makes their denials convincing. The same articulateness that initially impressed you makes their explanations persuasive. The practical defense against the halo effect requires a discipline that feels almost rude. Deliberate compartmentalization. When someone impresses you strongly in one dimension, consciously remind yourself that this tells you nothing reliable about their character in other dimensions. Charisma and ethics are genuinely independent variables. Attractiveness and trustworthiness are genuinely independent variables. The halo is not evidence. It is an impression, and impressions, however vivid, are not facts. 7. Manufactured scarcity. Only 3 left in stock. This offer expires in 47 minutes. Limited edition. Once it is gone forever. 12 other people are viewing this item right now. Every one of these phrases is an activation key for one of the most primitive and reliable circuits in the human brain. The scarcity response. The sense that a resource is running out, that an opportunity is closing, that time is shorter than comfortable. This produces a specific, recognizable neurological state: urgency, anxiety, an overwhelming pressure to act before the window closes. For the vast majority of human history, this response served a genuine survival function. A berry patch running out of berries was a real threat. A shelter site being claimed by others was a real emergency. The brain that did not respond to these signals with urgency was the brain whose genes did not get passed on. Evolution selected, very thoroughly, for a nervous system that takes scarcity seriously. Modern, commercial interests have reverse-engineered this ancient system with extraordinary precision. Most countdown timers reset when you close and reopen the tab. Most last remaining items are restocked within hours. Most limited editions quietly return in slightly different packaging. The scarcity is not real, but the neurological response to it is just as real as it would be if the threat were genuine. What makes manufactured scarcity particularly insidious is that it does something subtle and damaging to the quality of your thinking, precisely at the moment when you most need to think clearly. Research by behavioral economist Sendhil Mullainathan found that people operating under conditions of perceived scarcity, whether of time, money, or resources, show measurably reduced performance on tasks requiring careful reasoning. The mind tunnels. It fixates on the scarce thing and loses peripheral vision. You become worse at evaluating whether you actually want something at the precise moment when you are being most aggressively persuaded to want it. High-pressure sales tactics are built entirely on this principle. The offer is only available right now. The price goes up at midnight. You need to decide before you leave this room. None of these structures are there to serve you. They are there to prevent you from thinking. The urgency is the mechanism. The mechanism is designed to produce a specific output. A commitment made before reflection can occur. The defense is almost insultingly simple. Impose your own delay. Any legitimate opportunity can wait 24 hours. Any decision that cannot survive a single night of reflection is a decision someone else is making for you. 8. Anchoring bias. A question before we continue. Is the population of Australia more or less than 50 million people? Form your estimate. Now, what do you think the actual population of Australia is? Whatever number just came to mind was almost certainly influenced by 50 million. Even though you know that 50 million was an arbitrary number dropped into a question. Research on anchoring has replicated this effect hundreds of times across dozens of contexts. The first number we encounter in a decision-making situation acts as a gravitational center that pulls our final estimate toward it. Regardless of its accuracy or relevance, anchoring works because human beings are not absolute evaluators. We are relative evaluators. We do not assess things against some internal, objective scale. We assess them against whatever reference point has been most recently and most prominently established in our awareness. The anchor does not need to be accurate. It does not need to be logical. It simply needs to be first. Nowhere is anchoring deployed more systematically and more lucratively than in negotiation and retail. A garment priced at $800 and marked down to $300 feels like a remarkable bargain. But if it had simply been priced at $300 from the beginning, most people would consider it expensive. The original price, which may never have represented any actual transaction, functions solely as an anchor to make the current price feel reasonable by comparison. Car dealerships begin negotiation from a listed price that neither party expects to pay, because the listed price anchors every subsequent concession to a number that serves the seller's interests. Salary negotiators are advised to make the first offer, because whoever sets the first number defines the range within which all subsequent offers will feel appropriate. Anchoring has been documented in judicial sentencing. When prosecutors request higher sentences at the outset, the final sentences handed down by judges, who believe they are reasoning independently, who are statistically higher than when prosecutors request lower sentences. The anchor moves the entire distribution of outcomes without any party necessarily intending it to. The practical defense requires a specific cognitive habit. Before accepting any reference point, ask where it came from and who put it there. Numbers do not appear in negotiations accidentally. The first number in any high-stakes situation is almost always a tool. Recognize it as one before you let it reshape your expectations. 9. The foot in the door technique. Would you be willing to wear a small pin on your jacket supporting road safety? A simple yes or no question. The pin is small. The cause is uncontroversial. Almost everyone says yes. 2 weeks later, someone returns with a different request. Would you be willing to allow a large roadside billboard to be installed on your property? One large enough to partially obstruct your home from the street? In a landmark 1966 study, people who had agreed to the small pin were many times more likely to agree to the billboard than people who had not been asked the small question first. A minor initial commitment had fundamentally shifted the probability of a major subsequent one. This is the foot in the door technique, and the mechanism that makes it work is one of the most powerful and most thoroughly documented kinds of the drive for self-consistency. Once you have said yes to something, once you have signed, agreed, committed, acted, you develop a psychological stake in seeing yourself as someone who agreed with that thing. The self-concept is involved. To change your position would require acknowledging, at least implicitly, that your earlier decision was made under incomplete information or social pressure. Most people find that acknowledgement uncomfortable enough to avoid. It is far easier, psychologically, to remain consistent with who you have already declared yourself to be. This is why cult recruitment never begins with extreme demands. It begins with a free meal, a pleasant afternoon, a small donation, a casual conversation. Each small yes constructs an identity. I am someone who participates in this community. By the time the significant demands arrive, the identity has already been built around the organization. Leaving would not just mean declining a request. It would mean dismantling a part of who you understand yourself to be. It is why abusive relationships escalate slowly. The concessions that would be refused outright, if presented all at once, are accepted incrementally, each one redefining what normal looks like, each one making the next seem like a smaller step. The defense is a habit of attention to small requests from parties with unclear motives. The first yes is rarely about what it claims to be about. It is about building the foundation for the next one. 10. Social proof manipulation. 10,000 5-star reviews. Endorsed by 9 out of 10 experts. The most popular choice in your area. Join the 2 million people who have already made this decision. These are not simply facts about popularity. They are invocations of one of the most fundamental mechanisms of human social behavior. The tendency to use other people's choices as evidence for what the correct choice is. Social proof is not a manipulation in its basic form. It is an extraordinarily efficient information processing strategy. If thousands of people who share your approximate circumstances have chosen a particular option and found it satisfactory, that is genuinely relevant information about the quality of that option. The crowd is often right. The wisdom of many people's independent choices often exceeds the wisdom of any single person's analysis. The manipulation begins when the social proof is manufactured, when the reviews are purchased, when the 5-star ratings are generated by bots, when the follower counts are inflated by fake accounts, when the expert endorsements are paid for rather than earned. The signal that should indicate genuine quality has been systematically divorced from actual quality. But our brain continues to respond to the signal as though the relationship is intact. Platforms understand this perfectly. View counts, like counts, follower counts. These numbers are displayed prominently not because they are the most relevant information about a piece of content, but because they are the most efficient trigger for social proof responses. Seeing a video with 2 million views makes it harder to dismiss, harder to criticize, harder to walk away from, regardless of whether the 2 million viewers had good taste or good judgment. In extremist recruitment, the manufacture of consensus is among the most powerful tools available. When every voice you encounter online seems to hold the same beliefs with the same conviction, when the apparent consensus is overwhelming, resisting it requires a degree of independent courage that most human beings simply do not have wired into them. The crowd is usually right. The crowd that has been manufactured is always wrong, but from the inside you cannot easily tell the difference. The useful question when confronted with social proof is always, and are the people whose choices constituted anything like me? The crowd of people who have reviewed this specific product in this specific category may be your peers. The crowd of anonymous accounts expressing the same political opinion may not be people at all. 11. Authority bias. A man in a white lab coat tells you that the procedure is safe and the benefits are well established. A woman behind an official seal tells you the policy is necessary and the concerns are overblown. A figure in uniform tells you the situation is under control and your compliance is required. How much resistance you offer to these claims depends far less on their content than on whether you have been socially conditioned to defer to the uniform, the coat, the seal. Authority bias is one of the oldest and most thoroughly documented phenomena in social psychology. Stanley Milgram's 1961 experiments, in which ordinary people administered what they believed, were severe electric shocks to screaming subjects simply because a man in a white coat told them to continue, revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the human relationship with authority. The willingness to defer, to suspend independent judgment in the presence of perceived expertise or institutional legitimacy, is not a character flaw. It is a social adaptation. In complex societies, we cannot all be experts in everything. Deference to legitimate authority is often the appropriate response.
The exploitation begins
when the symbols of authority are divorced from the substance, when the uniform is a costume, when the credential is purchased. when the institutional affiliation is fabricated or irrelevant. Con artists have understood for centuries that the right outfit can bypass almost any degree of rational skepticism. A person in a hard hat and a clipboard can access almost any restricted space in almost any institution, because the uniform does the cognitive work that scrutiny would otherwise require. Medical authority is perhaps the most consequential arena for this bias. Research has shown that patients are significantly less likely to question treatment recommendations from physicians, even when those recommendations are incorrect, than they would be from an equal whose expertise they did not automatically defer to. The white coat is not just clothing. It is a cognitive override. The corrective is not to distrust authority universally. Expertise is real, and genuine expertise deserves significant weight. The corrective is to distinguish between legitimate authority, demonstrated knowledge and trustworthy intent in the specific domain in question, and the performance of authority which produces the psychological response without any of the substance that would justify it. 12. Intermittent reinforcement BF. Skinner discovered something about rats in the 1950s that turned out to be one of the most consequential findings in the entire history of behavioral science. Rats rewarded every time they pressed a lever, learned to press the lever when they needed a reward, and stop when they did not. Rats rewarded only sometimes on an unpredictable schedule pressed the lever, compulsively, obsessively, far beyond any reasonable need, and continued pressing it long after the rewards stopped coming entirely. The difference between a predictable reward and an unpredictable one is the difference between a tool and an addiction. Intermittent reinforcement works because of a specific feature of the dopamine system, when a reward is certain. When pressing the lever always produces the pellet. The dopamine response is stable and moderate. When the reward is uncertain, when pressing the lever might produce the pellet, or might not, and there is no reliable way to predict which. The dopamine system generates a much more intense response. The brain treats the uncertainty itself as compelling. The not knowing becomes the engine of continued behavior. This is not a quirk of rat psychology. It is the fundamental mechanism underlying every form of gambling. The slot machine does not pay every time. It pays sometimes. The randomness is not a flaw in the design. The randomness is the design. Without the uncertainty, the machine would not produce addiction. It is specifically the inability to predict the outcome that makes the behavior compulsive. Intermittent reinforcement produces some of the most difficult-to-break attachments in existence. A partner who is sometimes warm and attentive and sometimes cold and dismissive, with no reliable pattern, no learnable rule for predicting which version will appear, creates exactly the same neurological environment as the slot machine. The warm moments feel disproportionately precious because they are unpredictable. The cold moments are endured in the urgent hope that warmth is coming. People in these relationships frequently describe feeling addicted to a person who makes them miserable. That description is neurologically accurate. They are not experiencing dysfunction or weakness. They are experiencing a textbook response to intermittent reinforcement. Recognizing the pattern is the beginning of the only exit that works. If you notice that you are working increasingly hard to earn approval that arrives inconsistently and unpredictably, and that Each rare, warm moment feels so precious it justifies all the cold ones. You are not in a relationship. You are at a machine designed to keep you playing. 13. Emotional. Contagion. Emotions are not contained within individuals. They spread. They transmit through voice and expression and posture and the infinitely nuanced language of the human body. From one person to another, we catch emotions the way we catch weather. Not through decision, but through exposure. The neurological mechanism is mirror neurons, cells in the brain that fire not only when we perform an action or experience an emotion, but when we observe another person performing or experiencing them. They are the biological foundation of empathy, and they have been essential to human social functioning for our entire evolutionary history. The ability to feel something of what another person feels is what allows cooperation, compassion, and the coordination of collective action. But mirror neurons do not discriminate between genuine emotion and performed emotion. A skilled actor performing grief activates grief responses in their audience, regardless of whether the actor feels anything. A politician performing righteous anger transmits that anger to an audience, regardless of whether the anger reflects any genuine assessment of the situation. The emotional state is real in the recipient, whether or not it was real in the sender. Every skilled manipulator understands this at some level. The most effective persuasion does not begin with arguments. It begins with establishing an emotional state in the target. Create the emotional environment first, the sense of threat, or belonging, or injustice, or excitement, and the arguments arrive into a mind that has already been prepared to receive them. The evidence feels more compelling when you are already afraid. The promise feels more credible when you are already hopeful. Large gatherings are particularly powerful vehicles for emotional contagion because the effect compounds. Each person's mirrored emotional response contributes to the emotional environment that everyone else is mirroring. The crowd becomes a single organism with a single emotional state, and within that state, the rational capacities of individual members are substantially diminished. Leaders who understand this have always known that the most powerful thing they can do is fill a room. Awareness of emotional contagion is not a protection against it. Mirror neurons operate below the level of deliberate control, but it is the beginning of a useful pause. When you find yourself in an emotional state that you cannot trace to a clear internal cause, when you feel afraid or angry or euphoric without a personal reason that satisfies you, ask what room you just walked into and whose emotions you may be wearing. 14. The sunk cost trap. You have spent 2 years in a graduate program you no longer believe in. You have spent 4 years in a relationship that stopped working somewhere in the second year. You have spent 300 pages writing a book that you now recognize has fundamental problems. You have spent $10,000 on a business that the market has clearly rejected. The rational analysis is the same in every case. The past investment is gone. It cannot be recovered, regardless of what you do next. The only question with practical implications is, what is the best choice going forward? For the person you are right now, with the information you have right now. And yet, in every case, the same force exerts itself. The feeling that to stop would be to declare the spent years or money or effort meaningless. That to walk away is to admit waste. That to abandon is somehow to damage the past, as though the investment were still alive. and would feel the wound of your departure. This is the sunk cost fallacy. The irrational tendency to continue investing in something because of what you have already invested, rather than because of what the future investment will produce. And it is not a minor cognitive quirk. It is a force that keeps people in failing careers, in damaging relationships, in losing bets, and in organizations that no longer deserve their loyalty, for years or decades beyond any point of rational return. The sunk cost trap is deliberately exploited by any system that wants to prevent exits. Cults require escalating investments from members, time, money, relationships, public declarations, because each investment makes leaving feel more catastrophic. The investment is not primarily about the cult's needs. It is about constructing a psychological barrier to departure. The more you have given, the more leaving costs. The more leaving costs, the less likely you are to go. The correction requires a kind of cognitive ruthlessness, the ability to evaluate the future independently of the past. The question is never whether the past investment was worth it. The question is only what the next investment will produce. The years behind you are already written. The only pages you still hold are the ones ahead. 15. Confirmation bias. Show me the direction of someone's existing beliefs, and I can predict, with considerable accuracy, what evidence will persuade them. Not because people are stupid, not because they are malicious, but because the human mind is not a dispassionate processor of information. It is an advocate for whatever it already believes. Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek, interpret, wait, and remember information in ways that confirm pre-existing beliefs, is not a failure of intelligence. It may be a feature of the efficient mind. Updating your beliefs every time you encounter a single contradictory piece of information would be cognitively exhausting and epistemically premature. A reasonable prior belief should survive a reasonable amount of contrary evidence. Confirmation bias is the brain applying this efficiency principle too broadly and too aggressively. The cost of that misapplication in a world of infinitely available information is severe. Every belief, no matter how extreme, how factually unsupported, how recently contradicted by clear evidence, can be continuously validated by curating your information environment. You do not need to find truth. You only need to find sources that tell you what you already know. And in the current information environment, those sources are always available, always nearby, and algorithmically trained to remain perpetually in front of you. The most sophisticated users of confirmation bias are not advertisers or propagandists who invent new beliefs from scratch. They are those who identify the beliefs their target already holds, the resentments, the fears, the suspicions, the convictions about who deserves what, and build messaging that confirms and amplifies those existing beliefs. The target does not experience this as manipulation. They experience it as vindication. Finally, something that says what they already knew was true. The only genuine defense against confirmation bias is one of the hardest intellectual habits to build: the deliberate, systematic search for disconfirming evidence. Not for the sake of changing your mind automatically, but for the sake of testing your beliefs against the strongest available contrary evidence before you act on them. A belief that cannot survive encounter with its best counterarguments is not a belief worth acting on. 16. Memory. Manipulation. There is something deeply important that most people do not know about their own memories. They are not recordings. They feel like recordings. The subjective experience of remembering something is the experience of replaying, watching the scene again as it actually happened. But the neuroscience tells a different story, one that is considerably more unsettling. Every time you recall a memory, you are not playing back a stored file. You are reconstructing it, assembling it from fragments, filling gaps with plausible inferences, updating the reconstruction with everything you currently know and believe. And here is the critical detail. Every reconstruction can alter the source. Each time you remember something, you are potentially changing what you will remember next time. Elizabeth Loftus built her career demonstrating this with elegant and disturbing precision. In her most famous series of experiments, she showed subjects footage of traffic accidents and then asked them to estimate the speed of the vehicles, changing a single word in the question, smashed versus contacted, produced significantly different speed estimates, and, when questioned a week later, different memories of what the subjects claimed to have seen. A word planted in a question had altered a memory of an event. In a later series, Loftus implanted entirely false childhood memories in adult subjects by providing a false account of a childhood event. Getting lost in a shopping mall, having a frightening encounter, and then asking subjects to think about it and describe what they remembered. A significant proportion of subjects produced detailed, confident memories of events that had never occurred. When told the event was fabricated, many of them resisted the correction. The false memory had become their memory. In the context of manipulation, this research has profound and troubling implications. A partner who consistently rewrites the history of your arguments, who describes events with enough confidence and repetition that your own recollection begins to waver, is not just lying. They are, over extended time, actually altering your memories. What you remember of the relationship, of conversations, of who said what and when, becomes their version more than yours. Your memories are the foundation of your identity and your sense of reality. They can be edited gently and persistently by anyone with sufficient access and sufficient patience. This is not a comfortable thing to know, but knowing it is the beginning of protecting it. 17. Divide and conquer. The strategy is ancient, documented in sources as old as written history. Julius Caesar used it to prevent the tribes of Gaul from uniting against Roman expansion. Colonial empires used it to prevent subject populations from organizing around shared grievances. And today, it operates in families, in workplaces, in political systems, and in the architecture of social media with a sophistication and a scale that the ancient practitioners of the strategy could not have imagined. Divide and conquer rests on a single insight. Unified groups are dangerous. Fragmented groups are manageable. A collection of individuals, each competing against the others for resources, recognition, or approval, is far more tractable than the same collection organized around their common interests and grievances. The objective is always the same: prevent coordination, manufacture conflict between people who would otherwise be allies, keep everyone focused on each other so they cannot focus on the actual source of their difficulties. In intimate relationships, dividing and conquering looks like the systematic isolation of a target from their support network. The process is rarely sudden or obviously aggressive. It begins with small observations. Your family has never really understood you. Your friends don't seem to treat you with the respect you deserve. I've noticed that you always seem drained after you see them. I wonder if they realize how much they take from you. Each comment is planted as a seed of doubt. Over time, those seeds grow into distance, and the distance grows into walls. When the walls are complete, the target's entire social world has been reduced to a single relationship, the one being used to control them. In organizational settings, divide and conquer prevents employees from organizing against management by keeping them focused on resentments toward each other. Strategic gossip, selective information sharing, manufactured competitions for resources or recognition. These create environments in which people who share interests spend their energy on interpersonal conflict rather than collective action. On the scale of entire societies, the strategy produces its largest and most durable effects. When a population is successfully divided along lines of race, religion, class, or culture, each fragment sees the other fragments as its primary competition and threat. The energy that might otherwise produce accountability and reform is consumed by internal conflict. Whoever holds power above the conflict is never the target. 18. In 1973, 4 people were taken hostage in a Stockholm bank vault by a man named Jan Erik Olsson. Over 6 days, something happened that was so counterintuitive, so structurally bizarre, that the psychiatrist brought in to analyze it needed to create a new term to describe it. The hostages developed positive feelings for their captor. They came to fear the police more than the man who was threatening their lives. After their release, they defended him publicly, refused to testify against him, and in at least one documented case, formed a lasting emotional bond with him. The experience of being at his mercy had somehow produced attachment rather than hatred. Stockholm Syndrome, named after the city of that first documented case, describes the psychological process by which a person held under extreme duress by another develops positive feelings, loyalty, and even affection for the person who controls them. It has since been documented in hostage situations, in cases of prolonged domestic abuse, in prisoners of war, and in members of high control groups. The mechanism, understood from inside it, is not as paradoxical as it initially appears. When your survival is entirely contingent on another person's goodwill, when that person controls whether you eat, whether you are harmed, whether you live, your brain performs a cognitive adaptation that is genuinely protective in the short term. Any small kindness from the person with power over you is interpreted as disproportionately significant. A captor who provides a meal is experienced as generous. A captor who chooses not to hurt you today is experienced as caring. The alternative psychological response, maintaining a clear, sustained recognition of the full horror of your situation, is psychologically destabilizing in a way that the brain resists. It is simply more sustainable, emotionally, to find ways to experience the captor as something other than a pure threat. The adaptation, preserve, function under otherwise crushing conditions. The difficulty this creates for anyone trying to help is significant. A person experiencing Stockholm Syndrome may actively resist liberation, genuinely believing that their captors' interests align with their own. They may interpret offers of help as threats. They may advocate for the person who is harming them. This is not brainwashing in the popular sense. It is a survival mechanism that has overextended its reach, and it cannot be addressed by simply presenting evidence or logic. 19. Triangulation. You are in a conversation, and your partner mentions, in passing, someone new. A colleague, an old friend, an acquaintance. They describe this person with a particular kind of warmth. Not excessive, not inappropriate, just slightly more animated than the context seems to require. And something shifts inside you. A small, cold awareness that someone exists whose relationship with your partner you do not fully know. A faint but persistent pressure to be more. To compete, somehow, without knowing the rules or the prize. That small shift is what triangulation is designed to produce. Triangulation is the introduction of a third party, real, exaggerated, or entirely fictional, into a two-person relationship for the specific purpose of creating insecurity, competition, and emotional destabilization in the target. The third party is not the point. The point is the psychological effect on you. The effect is designed to redirect your attention from evaluating the relationship honestly to simply trying to earn the manipulator's continued approval once you are competing. Rather than evaluating, the balance of the relationship has fundamentally shifted. You start working harder. You become more accommodating. You raise your tolerance for behavior you would previously have challenged, because challenging it risks the outcome of a competition you have not accepted but are now somehow losing. The manipulator gains leverage not by making any additional demand, but simply by making you uncertain of your standing. In family systems, triangulation is deployed by parents who pit siblings against each other for approval and affection, often without any conscious intent. The child who learns that parental love is a competition learns to see other people as competitors. Before they learn to see them as companions, they carry that pattern into every subsequent relationship. In workplaces, managers who use triangulations keep employees performing at maximum effort through the threat of replacement rather than through genuine appreciation. The employee is never quite secure enough to rest, never quite certain enough to ask for what they need, never quite confident enough to challenge anything. The exit from triangulation begins not with the third party, but with a direct question addressed to yourself. Am I responding to what this person is actually doing, or to a threat they have implied without stating? The implied threat only has power if you accept the terms of the competition. You are not required to. 20. Manufactured identity. The deepest and most complete form of manipulation does not target a single decision. It does not target a single belief. It targets the foundation from which all decisions and all beliefs emerge. It targets identity. When someone controls not just what you think, but who you understand yourself to be. When they shape the story you tell yourself about your own values, your own loyalties, your own purpose in the world. They do not need to manipulate individual choices. They have installed the software that generates your choices automatically. Every decision flows from the identity. Control the identity, and you control everything downstream. The manufacture of identity is the central project of every cult, every authoritarian political movement, and every sufficiently committed abusive relationship that has endured long enough to do its deepest work. It begins with a mirror. The recruiter, the abuser, the charismatic leader sees you with unusual intensity. They reflect back a version of you that feels more vivid and more true than anything the ordinary world has offered. You are not ordinary. You are exceptional. You have been misunderstood by people who lack the perception to recognize your real qualities. Here, finally, is someone who sees who you actually are. This mirroring is among the most seductive experiences available to a human being. To be seen, truly, deeply, specifically seen, is one of our most fundamental needs. For people who have felt invisible or unappreciated or perpetually misunderstood, it can feel like oxygen, and in that state of feeling genuinely recognized, the natural response is openness, gratitude, attachment. The person doing the mirroring becomes associated with something that feels essential. But the mirror is also a mold. As the relationship deepens, the reflection begins to shift. You are not just an exceptional individual. You are a member of this community, a carrier of this truth, a soldier in this cause. Your old relationships were with people who did not really understand you. Your old values were those of someone who had not yet been enlightened. Your old self was smaller than the self you are becoming here. By the time the reconstruction is complete, the original self may be nearly inaccessible. Leaving the group does not just mean losing a community. It means losing the identity that was built within it. For many people, that loss feels like annihilation. And that terror is precisely what it was designed to produce. 21. The reciprocity trap. A stranger presses a flower into your hand in an airport and smiles warmly before you have had any chance to prepare a response. Then, a moment later, they ask for a donation to their organization. You did not ask for the flower. You did not want the flower. You would, if given the choice, prefer not to have the flower, and yet something inside you feels the pull of obligation. You have been given something. Something in you needs to give something back. This pull is the reciprocity principle, one of the most deeply embedded and most reliably operative principles of human social behavior. In every documented human culture, in every studied society, norms around reciprocating gifts and favors have been found to be near universal. They exist because they are adaptive. Mutual exchange, mutual obligation, the social expectation of return for kindness. These are the foundations of cooperative societies. Without reciprocity, cooperation collapses. The exploitation of this principle is among the oldest commercial and manipulative strategies in the human toolkit. The free sample at the grocery store is not there because the company wants you to try their product. The cost of every free sample is calculated against the conversion rate it produces. The sample exists because receiving something creates an internal pressure to reciprocate that measurably increases purchasing behavior, even when the recipient would prefer not to feel that pressure. Research on reciprocity in medical contexts has produced some of the most consequential findings in this area. Pharmaceutical companies spend significant resources providing gifts, meals, and educational events for physicians. Studies consistently that even physicians who firmly believe they are not influenced by such gifts are statistically more likely to prescribe the products of companies that have provided them. The reciprocity operates below the level of conscious decision-making. What makes the reciprocity trap particularly reliable is that it activates even when the original gift was unsolicited, unwanted, or obviously strategic. We feel the obligation. Not because we want the gift, but because we have received it. The social norm does not check motives. It simply registers receipt and generates obligation. The awareness that breaks this trap is the recognition that a gift with an agenda is not a gift. It is an opening position. You are not obligated to complete someone else's transaction. 22. Cognitive dissonance. Amplification. The human mind requires a degree of internal consistency to function. We need to be able to experience ourselves as coherent, as people whose beliefs, values, and actions roughly align. When they do not align, when we hold two beliefs that contradict each other, or when our actions conflict sharply with our stated values, we experience a state of psychological discomfort that Leon Festinger, the psychologist who identified it in 1957, called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance in its ordinary form is actually healthy. It is the friction that motivates growth, the discomfort that eventually drives drive to bring your behavior into alignment with your values, or to revise beliefs that cannot survive examination. But in the hands of a skilled manipulator, it becomes something very different. A lever.
The amplification of cognitive dissonance as a control technique works by deliberately creating or highlighting the tension between a person's stated values and their current situation,
And
then offering a resolution that serves the manipulator's interests.
you care about your family, and yet you are considering leaving this organization that protects families. How do you reconcile that? You believe in honesty, and yet you have doubts. Doubt is the beginning of betrayal. Each statement presses on a contradiction and then channels the discomfort toward a predetermined resolution. In cult dynamics, cognitive dissonance amplification explains one of the most counterintuitive phenomena in group psychology. The tendency of members to become more committed after a core belief is publicly disproven. When something the group predicted does not occur, the rational expectation is that members would lose faith. What consistently happens instead is that committed members rationalize, reframe, and often recruit more aggressively. The investment in the belief has become too large to abandon. The dissonance of having been wrong is resolved not by updating the belief, but by amplifying commitment to it. In everyday manipulation, the technique shows up whenever someone presents your legitimate uncertainty or normal ambivalence as evidence of a character flaw. You are not simply undecided. You are disloyal. You are not simply asking a question. You are showing your true colors. The discomfort of this accusation, if accepted, can be relieved only by demonstrating the commitment being questioned. And demonstrating commitment, of course, is exactly what the manipulator wanted. 23. Learned helplessness. In a landmark series of experiments in the 1960s, Martin Seligman exposed dogs to electric shocks that they had no means of stopping. Unlike a control group, whose shocks could be terminated by pressing a panel, these dogs had no lever, no button, no action that made any difference. The shocks simply came, and nothing they did affected whether they came or when they stopped. Later, Seligman placed these dogs in a situation where escape was simple. A low barrier they could easily jump to reach a section of the chamber where no shocks were administered. The control dogs learned the escape route immediately and used it every time. The dogs who had experienced uncontrollable shocks did not. They lay down, they whimpered, they endured shocks that they could have ended in seconds because they had learned, in the most fundamental neurological sense, that their actions did not control their outcomes. Seligman called this learned helplessness, and its translation into human psychology is both precise and devastating. A child who grows up in an environment where their efforts reliably produce no positive results, where praise is withheld regardless of achievement, where punishment arrives regardless of behavior, where the rules seem to shift without pattern or reason, learns the same lesson those dogs learn. Agency is an illusion. Trying makes no difference. Whatever happens to you is not connected to what you do. This learning is not a conscious belief. It is a pattern encoded at the level of the nervous system, and it follows people into adulthood with a persistence that rational reassurance alone cannot dislodge. In abusive systems, learned helplessness is not a side effect. It is a design goal. The abuser who creates an environment of unpredictable reward and punishment, where no behavior reliably produces safety, where the rules are constantly changing, where the target cannot learn what is expected of them, is engineering helplessness as deliberately as any experiment. A person who believes that nothing they do makes any difference does not need to be restrained. They restrain themselves. Recovery from learned helplessness begins not with insight, but with evidence. The nervous system needs to experience, repeatedly, reliably, that action produces outcomes, small actions, producing small but real results. Over time, these experiences rebuild what the original environment destroyed. The sense that you are an agent in your own life, and that your choices have weight. 24. The framing effect, a medical procedure, carries a 90% survival rate. The same procedure carries a 10% mortality rate. The numbers are identical. The information is the same, and yet research consistently demonstrates that patients presented with the survival framing are significantly more likely to consent to the procedure than those presented with the mortality framing. This is the framing effect, the discovery that the way information is presented, grounds, the words chosen, the emphasis placed, shapes, the reference established, shapes how that information is processed and what conclusions it generates, often more powerfully than the information itself. The brain does not receive data neutrally and then apply values. It receives data already shaped by language, and the shaping is invisible. A policy that protects the employment of 80% of workers and a policy that results in the unemployment of 20% of workers describe the same policy, but the former activates a frame of preservation and success. The latter activates a frame of loss and failure. The emotional valence is different, and emotion drives evaluation. Political language is constructed almost entirely around frame selection. The same set of facts about immigration can be organized around frames of threat or frames of contribution. The same economic policy can be framed as fiscal discipline or as cruel austerity. The same act of civil disobedience can be framed as heroic resistance or violent law-breaking. No frame is purely neutral. Each one makes certain conclusions feel natural and certain others feel foreign. Not by providing different evidence, but by establishing different terrain. on which the evidence will be interpreted. In personal relationships, framing shapes the moral universe of arguments. I am concerned about. Your drinking is a frame of care. You have a problem is a frame of diagnosis. You always do this. When you are stressed is a frame of pattern and pathology. The same behavior, framed differently, produces different responses, different emotional states, different negotiations of blame and responsibility. The defense against the framing effect is a habit that requires considerable practice, actively constructing alternative frames for important decisions before committing to a conclusion. If something is presented as a 90% chance of success, deliberately restate it as a 10% chance of failure and check whether your evaluations changes. If it does, you have found where the frame is doing its work. 25. The contrast principle: hold your hand in a bowl of ice-cold water for 30 seconds. Then place it in a bowl of room temperature water. The room temperature water will feel warm. Genuinely, uncomfortably warm. Even though it has not changed at all, the cold has recalibrated your sensory reference point. You are now measuring temperature not against an objective scale, but against your most recent experience. This is not a quirk of temperature perception. It is a fundamental feature of all human evaluation. We do not assess things in absolute terms. We assess them relative to whatever we have most recently encountered, and whoever controls the sequence of what you encounter controls the conclusions you reach. Real estate agents have long understood this and used it strategically. They begin by showing clients properties significantly above their stated budget. Properties that are beautiful, spacious, luxuriously appointed. The client is not expected to purchase these properties. The properties exist to recalibrate the client's reference point. After an afternoon spent in those spaces, the property that the agent actually intends to sell feels reasonably priced, even if it would have felt expensive in isolation.
In
Salary negotiation, presenting an initial offer significantly above the final desired outcome, recalibrates the other party's sense of what is reasonable. Their subsequent counteroffer is anchored to your inflated starting point. The contrast between your first number and their counter makes whatever they propose feel like a significant concession, even if it is exactly what they would have offered from the beginning. The contrast principle in abusive relationships operates through a dynamic that takes time to establish but is then very difficult to dismantle. The abuser creates a sustained baseline of mistreatment and then periodically offers gestures of normalcy or kindness. Against the backdrop of consistent mistreatment, the ordinary gesture feels extraordinary. The partner who is not being screamed at today is experienced as being warm. The partner who remembers your birthday is experienced as demonstrating deep care. The contrast between the normal and the terrible has compressed the normal into a category that would be unrecognizable in a healthy relationship. The corrective for the contrast principle is the same in every domain. Deliberate attention to the baseline. Ask not how this compares to what came immediately before. Ask how it compares to what you would expect if you had never encountered the thing that preceded it. 26. Negging. You have just been introduced to someone charming and confident. The conversation is going well, and then they say something that is not quite an insult but is not quite a compliment either. Interesting outfit. It's almost working. Or, you're actually pretty smart. I wasn't expecting that. or a barely perceptible pause before agreeing with something you said, followed by a slightly too enthusiastic pivot to a different topic. You are not quite sure what just happened, but something in you has shifted. There is now a small, persistent awareness of this person's evaluation of a you, a slight pressure to demonstrate that the near-miss compliment was wrong about you, that the standard being implied is one you can actually meet. This is negging, a term originating in pickup culture but describing a behavior pattern that extends far beyond romantic pursuit. A neg is a subtle, calibrated put designed not to insult clearly, but to introduce a small wound of self-doubt and, simultaneously, position the person delivering it as someone whose approval requires effort to earn. The mechanism operates through a quirk of human motivation. We tend to be most motivated to seek approval from people whose approval is not guaranteed. Unconditional warmth from a stranger costs them nothing and signals little about our worth. But withheld or conditional warmth from someone who seems to have standards, that conditional approval carries weight. The sting of the near miss creates the desire to close the gap. The desire to close the gap redirects our attention from evaluating the person to impressing them. In sustained relationships, negging maintains a power imbalance through a pattern of low-level undermining that is consistent enough to keep the target insecure, but calibrated carefully enough to stop short of obvious cruelty. The target is never quite confident enough in the relationship to relax or ask for what they need. They are perpetually competing for an approval that is perpetually just out of reach. The recognition that breaks this pattern is simple to state and genuinely difficult to apply in the emotional reality of feeling stung. Someone who finds you genuinely interesting and valuable does not need to manufacture your self-doubt in order to engage with you. Confidence in a partner or a connection does not require cultivating your insecurity. If someone's interest in you is structurally dependent on making you feel slightly inadequate, that interest is not what it is presenting itself as. 27. Hoovering. You have made a decision that was costly. You have created distance from a relationship that was harming you. You have stopped responding to messages. You have held the boundary for long enough that you have begun, tentatively, to feel something like freedom. And then they reach out. Not with the behavior that drove you away. Not with demands or accusations or escalation. With something disarming. A memory. I was just thinking about that time we went to the coast. With apparent vulnerability. Things have been very hard since you left. I'm not doing well. With what sounds like genuine growth. I've been doing a lot of reflection. I know I wasn't what you needed. I'm working on it. Something in you softens. Maybe things really have changed. Maybe you were wrong to go. Maybe giving it one more chance costs less than the loneliness of having left. This is hoovering. Named after the vacuum cleaner brand, because its purpose is to suck you back into a relationship you were successfully leaving. It is among the most reliably deployed and most reliably effective tools in the repertoire of narcissistic and manipulative individuals. And it is specifically timed to activate at the moment when your departure is beginning to succeed. What distinguishes hoovering from genuine reconnection is timing and motivation. A person who genuinely misses you and genuinely wants to repair something reaches out in all kinds of moments. Not specifically in the window when you are pulling away. A hoover, by contrast, intensifies precisely in proportion to the distance you create. As long as you are present, there is no urgency. The moment you leave, the contact becomes constant. The content of the Hoover is also consistently structured around your specific vulnerabilities. If you left because of emotional unavailability, the Hoover offers warmth. If you left because of a lack of accountability, the Hoover offers apparent remorse. If you are motivated by caretaking, the Hoover offers suffering. The message is custom-fitted to what would most effectively reactivate your attachment. The pattern itself is the information, not the content of any particular message. The pattern of intensified contact following your successful withdrawal is diagnostic, regardless of how sincere the individual messages seem. Distance is information, and what the distance reveals about the other person's response to it is worth reading clearly.
28. 28.
Pacing and leading. The most effective persuasion does not begin with the thing you want to persuade someone of. It begins with where they already are. This principle, so obvious once stated, so systematically ignored by anyone who has ever tried to change someone's mind by immediately presenting the correct answer, is the foundation of a technique called pacing and leading. Pacing means meeting the other person in their current reality, not arguing with it, not correcting it, mirroring it. You are frustrated with the system. Yes, the system has significant problems. You feel like nobody listens. That is a genuinely difficult experience. You have tried the conventional approaches, and they have not worked. That is understandable. Each statement confirms the person's existing experience, creating the neurological experience of being understood. And the experience of being understood creates a state of openness, reduced defensiveness, lowered critical vigilance. Leading follows. Once the pacing has established a genuine sense of rapport, once the other person has had the experience of having their reality accurately reflected, the pacer begins to introduce slight variations. The frame shifts almost imperceptibly. The alternative possibility is introduced so gently that it does not trigger resistance. And because the person is already in a state of feeling understood and safe, they follow the lead without the skepticism they would have brought to a cold approach. In its benign forms, pacing and leading is simply skilled communication. Every good therapist, teacher, and mediator uses some version of it. Meeting people where they are before trying to take them somewhere new is not manipulation. It is competence. The manipulation begins when the destination of the leading serves the leader's interests at the expense of the person being led. A cult recruiter who paces your loneliness and sense of disconnection before leading you toward a community that will consume your autonomy is using the technique predatorily. The pacing is real, the empathy is performed, and the destination was selected before the conversation began. The signal that distinguishes genuine understanding from strategic pacing is whether the person doing it seems interested in your conclusions or only in their own. Someone who genuinely understands you can be challenged, can receive new information, can update their view. Someone who is pacing you toward a predetermined outcome remains consistent regardless of what you say. Their agreement is never quite full. Their empathy is always in service of a direction. 29. Exploiting empathy. Empathy is one of the most beautiful capacities of the human mind. The ability to feel something of what another person feels, to allow their experience to matter to you, to be moved by their suffering toward action. is not a weakness. It is the foundation of every cooperative, compassionate, and genuinely moral form of human behavior. It can be weaponized, not in spite of its beauty, but because of it. The exploitation of empathy follows a reliable pattern. The manipulator presents suffering, genuine or fabricated, their own, or belonging to someone they represent, with enough emotional vividness to activate the listener's empathetic response. Once activated, that response creates a felt obligation. You feel the suffering. You do not want to be a person who does nothing about suffering they can feel. The manipulator has a specific action that will relieve the suffering. The action happens to serve them in intimate manipulation. This takes the form of weaponized vulnerability, a partner who consistently presents themselves as fragile, who communicates, explicitly or through implication, that your presence is the only thing standing between them and some form of collapse, is creating an empathic trap. Your care and concern, which are genuine and good, become the mechanism of your control, maintaining your own needs, setting limits. Pursuing your own life begins to feel like an act of violence against someone who needs you. The trap is particularly difficult to exit because leaving it does not feel like escaping manipulation. It feels like choosing yourself over someone who is suffering. And the willingness to choose yourself over someone who is suffering is not a value that sits comfortably in most people who have strong empathy. The distinction between genuine vulnerability and weaponized vulnerability lies in what happens when you attempt to help in ways that do not involve the specific compliance being sought. Genuine vulnerability responds to support. It can be helped. It changes with care and time. Weaponized vulnerability cannot be relieved by anything except the specific compliance it is designed to produce. It is a lock, and only one key opens it. Noticing that distinction, asking whether your care is actually helping or simply feeding a mechanism, is the beginning of responding with both compassion and clarity.
30. Priming effects.
In a famous experiment, participants were asked to unscramble word puzzles before walking to another location for a debriefing. Some puzzles contained words associated with old age: wrinkled, retired, bingo, grey. Others contained neutral words. Hidden observers timed how long each participant took to walk down the corridor. The participants, who had unscrambled elderly associated words, walked measurably more slowly. They had not been told anything about aging. They had not been asked to think about being old. They had simply been briefly exposed to concepts associated with a category. And those concepts had activated associated behaviors without any awareness, without any intention, and without any possibility of resistance through ordinary vigilance. This is priming, the process by which exposure to one stimulus influences subsequent responses to related stimuli, operating below the threshold of conscious awareness and producing effects that the primed person is typically unable to detect or correct for. The commercial applications of priming have been explored with considerable sophistication. Restaurants that play French music sell more French wine. Stores that circulate the scent of fresh bread produce longer browsing times and larger purchases. Real estate showings with subtle seasonal decor that evokes home and warmth produce more favorable property evaluations. None of these effects require the consumer to notice or consciously process the priming stimulus. The association activates automatically and colors the evaluation before. Deliberate judgment even engages. Political messaging uses priming to establish emotional contexts before presenting substantive claims. A question about immigration asked immediately after reporting on crime activates a threat frame that will influence the evaluation of immigration policy, regardless of the factual content of either the crime report or the policy question. The frame is set before the content arrives, and the content is processed through the frame. The troubling implication is that we are always being primed by our environment, and we are almost entirely unaware of which associations have been recently activated and how they are shaping our current evaluations. The antidote is not vigilance. Vigilance cannot reach what operates before awareness. The antidote is to be deliberate about the environments you regularly inhabit and the associations they are continuously reinforcing. 31. Manufactured consensus. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch demonstrated that a significant proportion of people will give answers they know to be factually wrong if everyone around them is giving the wrong answer. They will say, with apparent conviction, that a shorter line is longer than a longer line, that something their own eyes tell them clearly is false is true, simply because the group has agreed it is true, and the social cost of disagreement is more immediately present than the epistemic cost of being wrong. This is conformity pressure, and manufactured consensus is its weaponized application. If you can create the appearance of overwhelming agreement, if you can make a view seem to be held by everyone, you can produce conformity in people who would never have arrived at that view independently. The appearance of consensus is the mechanism. The actual content of the view is almost secondary. Because, for most people, most of the time, the strongest signal about whether a belief is reasonable is whether everyone else seems to hold it. Social media platforms did not invent manufactured consensus, but they provided it with tools of extraordinary power. Coordinated networks of accounts, automated amplification of specific viewpoints, algorithmic systems that elevate content based on engagement signals rather than accuracy. These can transform a fringe position into an apparent mainstream within hours. The persons scrolling their feed encounters a view expressed again and again by what appears to be a diverse array of people. Each encounter reinforces the sense that this is simply what people think. Challenging it begins to feel like challenging reality itself. In smaller social systems, manufactured consensus operates through more intimate mechanisms. In a group where the leader has cultivated an environment where dissent is uncomfortable or dangerous, members learn to monitor each other for signs of agreement and to publicly perform agreement even when privately uncertain. The performance of consensus produces the experience of consensus for everyone watching. No one knows that the room is full of private doubters, because every private doubter is performing certainty. The manufactured agreement becomes experientially real. The antidote is the habit of asking, before accepting an apparent consensus as meaningful information, who are these people? How were they assembled? And what mechanism produced the agreement I am observing? Genuine consensus is hard to build. Manufactured consensus is increasingly easy to create. The difference between them is often invisible. unless you look for the infrastructure.
32. Isolation as control.
Among the most thoroughly documented and most consistently present features of coercive control, across intimate partner abuse, cult membership, human trafficking, and political imprisonment, is isolation. Not always physical isolation, though that appears too. Primarily social isolation. The systematic severing of the target's connections to other people who might offer alternative perspectives, emotional support, practical resources, or simply a witness to their experience. Isolation works as a control mechanism because human beings require social reality testing to maintain accurate perception. We evolved in groups that provided continuous feedback on our experiences, our judgments, and our sense of the world. When something happens to us, and we describe it to people who care about us, and they confirm our reading of it, we trust our perceptions. When we have no one to describe our experience to, or when everyone we describe it to offers the abuser's version rather than our own, we lose our epistemic foundation. The process of isolation in abusive relationships almost never begins with direct demands. It begins with observations. Your sister seems competitive with you. Your friend group is very demanding of your time. Your family has never really supported your growth. Each comment plants a seed. Over weeks and months, the seeds grow. Distance accumulates. Gradually and then suddenly, the target's social world has contracted to a single relationship, the one being used to harm them. Once isolated, the target is not simply more controllable. They are fundamentally more vulnerable to having their reality reshaped. There is no one to confirm their memory of events. There is no one to notice the changes in their personality and name them. There is no one to say you are different from how you used to be. Or, I remember when you used to feel differently about this. The isolated person is alone with their abuser's version of everything. The reversal of isolation is the beginning of recovery from its effects. But it requires something that the isolation has often destroyed. The belief that reconnection is possible, that the people who were pushed away can be approached again. Isolation does its deepest damage not by removing support, but by making the target feel that support no longer exists or was never real. The work of reaching back through that belief is some of the most significant work a person in these circumstances can do. 33. The psychology of secrets. There is a specific kind of power that comes from knowing something that others do not, and there is a specific kind of vulnerability that comes from having shared something that could be used against you. Manipulators understand both sides of this equation with precision, and they use secrets, the keeping of them, and the strategic revelation of them as instruments of control. Coercive systems often require members to share personal information that can later be used as leverage. The confession, the disclosure, the revelation of a past mistake or a present fear. These feel, in the moment of sharing, like intimacy. They feel like trust being built. And sometimes they are exactly that. But in the context of a manipulative relationship or a high-control organization, they are also the accumulation of material that ensures your compliance. I know something about you that you would not want others to know. That statement, expressed or merely implied, is sufficient to alter behavior in most people. The threat does not need to be explicit to be operative. The knowledge that the information exists and that it is held by someone with uncertain intentions, is enough to produce a persistent low-level compliance. A reluctance to challenge, to question, to leave. Secrets also function as instruments of division. In organizations where certain information is shared only with certain members, the hierarchy of access becomes a hierarchy of identity. Those who know more feel more important, more trusted, more deeply part of the inner circle. Those who know less feel provisional, aspirational, motivated to demonstrate the loyalty that would grant them access to the next level. The stratification of information creates a system of social incentives that the organization can exploit without any single explicit command. The relationship between secrecy and manipulation is one of the reasons that transparency, within appropriate limits of privacy, functions as a protective force in both personal and organizational life. What can be seen can be evaluated. What cannot be seen cannot be evaluated. And what cannot be evaluated cannot be challenged. The request to keep something secret, in any context where that secrecy serves the interests of the person making the request more than your own, is worth examining carefully. 34. The normalization of the abnormal. One of the most insidious features of sustained manipulation is that it does not arrive all at once. It arrives in increments. Each increment is small enough to tolerate. Each tolerance establishes a new baseline. Each new baseline makes the next increment feel smaller than it actually is. Over time, by a process so gradual it may be imperceptible, from inside, the completely unacceptable has been normalized. This process is sometimes described as the boiling frog phenomenon. The observation that a frog placed in gradually heating water will not notice the change and will not attempt to escape, while a frog dropped into already boiling water will immediately respond. The gradual change bypasses the alarm systems that would have fired in response to the sudden change. In abusive relationships, normalization explains what observers sometimes struggle to understand. How did this person get here? And why did they not leave earlier? The answer, typically, is that there was no single moment when things were clearly and unambiguously unacceptable. There was a long series of moments, each slightly worse than the one before, each one processed against the baseline of the previous one rather than against any external standard of health and dignity. By the time things were clearly unacceptable by any measure, the person inside had lost the reference point that would have made them clear. The deliberate exploitation of normalization as a technique involves a particular patience. The manipulator does not move too quickly. They establish each new baseline, wait for it to be accepted as normal, and only then introduce the next increment. It requires a long-term orientation that most people do not naturally associate with abusive dynamics, which are often imagined as impulsive or emotionally uncontrolled. Systematic normalization is neither impulsive nor uncontrolled. It is, in its way, disciplined. The defense requires deliberate comparison across time rather than only against the most recent baseline. Not, is this worse than last month? But, is this what I would have accepted 2 years ago? The gap between those two answers is the measure of how far the normalization has proceeded, and recognizing that gap with all its uncomfortable implications is the beginning of reorienting toward a standard that belongs to you rather than to the process that has been reshaping you. Closing thoughts. The techniques we have explored tonight are not exotic or rare. They are not the exclusive tools of criminals or tyrants. They are present in advertising that runs before every video, in relationships that feel frustratingly hard to leave, in political messaging that reaches millions of people before breakfast, in the architecture of every platform, designed to keep you engaged past the point of benefit. The reason they work is not that the people they work on are weak or unintelligent. The reason they work is that they are built on genuine features of human psychology, features that exist because they were adaptive, because they served the survival and social functioning of our ancestors in environments very different from the one we now inhabit. Reciprocity served cooperation. Authority, deference, served efficient social organization. Scarcity response served genuine resource competition. Social proof served navigation through uncertain environments. These features have not become dysfunctional. They still serve their original purposes in many contexts. What has changed is the presence of agents, advertisers, manipulators, cult leaders, abusers, political operators, who have systematically studied these features and developed precise techniques for activating them in controlled ways to produce outcomes that serve those agents' interests rather than yours. The defense is not cynicism. Cynicism breaks the trust mechanisms that make human cooperation possible. The defense is literacy. The ability to recognize when a technique is being applied, that a technique is being applied, and to pause just long enough to ask whose interests the technique is designed to serve. You will not always succeed. These techniques are effective in part because they are designed to bypass the window of reflection before it can open. But the more familiar they become, the more often that window opens in time. The name of a thing reduces its power. That is not poetic sentiment. It is one of the most well-supported findings in the psychology of influence. You know the names now. Sleep with them. Let them settle into the part of your thinking that works quietly in the background, recognizing patterns before you consciously seize, identify them. In the morning, and in every morning after that, the world will look about the same as it always has. But something in how you see it will be different. Rest now. You have done something worthwhile tonight. There is one final thing worth noting as you drift towards sleep. The techniques in this document are not reserved for villains. Most of the people who use them are not consciously aware that they are using them. A parent who guilt trips their child may never have heard the term guilt trip. A partner who love bombs may not know that the behavior has a name. A manager who uses intermittent reinforcement to keep their team anxious and productive may simply believe they are being a demanding but fair leader. This does not make the techniques less harmful, but it does suggest that the project of awareness is not primarily one of identifying enemies. It is one of becoming more precise about patterns. When you can name what is happening, you can respond to the pattern rather than simply reacting to the feeling it produces. You are no longer simply afraid, or confused, or guilty, or attached in ways that hurt you. You are someone who can see the shape of what is happening and make a choice about how to respond to it. That choice, small, quiet, and entirely internal, is what cannot be manufactured, manipulated, or taken from you. You can be made to feel things. You can be made to behave in ways you would not choose, but you cannot be prevented from eventually recognizing what was done and deciding differently. That recognition may take days or years. It may arrive slowly and partially, but it arrives. It always arrives. And when it does, you will find that the architecture of control, however elaborate, was never as permanent as it felt from inside it. The mind that knows its own vulnerabilities is the mind that has begun to protect them. You have taken a step in that direction tonight. Sleep well, and wake up a little harder to fool.